The morning my house disappeared, I was 700 miles away, sitting in a conference room with cold coffee in my hand. At 6:42 a.m., my neighbor called and said, "Caleb, there are 2 bulldozers at your gate," and before I could answer, I heard glass breaking through the phone. By lunchtime, the home my wife designed during the last month of her life was a pile of timber, stone, and dust, all because the president of our Homeowners Association claimed I owed $41,000 in fines I had already paid. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 53 then, a former appeals judge who had just been elected governor, and until that morning, I believed there was always some legal door you could knock on before somebody destroyed your life. My wife Rachel had been an architect, the kind of woman who could see a home where everyone else saw dirt and weeds. When cancer took her, she left behind one final design, a cedar and stone house above Lake Arden, with tall windows facing west and a reflecting pool that caught the sunset. 3 days before she died, she held my wrist and said, "Promise me you'll build it, even if you have to argue with every contractor in America." I laughed because that was Rachel, dying, exhausted, and still convinced contractors were the real enemy. I promised, and 2 years later I moved into the finished house inside a mountain community called Briar Summit. For 8 months, everything felt peaceful. Then I met Marlene Voss. Marlene had been HOA president for 11 years, wore silver bracelets that announced her arrival before she did, and drove a black Lincoln with a license plate that read RUES1. Our first disagreement was over the color of my porch beams. The architectural committee had approved charcoal gray, Rachel's choice, in writing. Marlene glanced at the letter and said, "Committees make recommendations. I make decisions." I should have fought her then, but I was still serving on the bench, so I paid a $600 fine and repainted. That surrender taught her the wrong lesson. Over the next year, she fined me for driveway lights, native flowers, a bird feeder, and the old Buick driven by my housekeeper, Elena Ruiz. Elena was born in New Mexico, but Marlene stopped her at the gate 4 times and asked whether she had proper documentation. When I called that discriminatory, Marlene replied, "I don't care where people come from, Caleb. I care whether they belong here." That sentence stayed with me. So did every receipt. I saved each canceled check, printed every approval email, and locked everything inside a fireproof safe beneath Rachel's design studio. Then I won the governor's race. 3 weeks after my inauguration, while I was attending a federal meeting in Chicago, Marlene sent one email at 6:42 in the morning. Final notice. Demolition authorized at 9. No hearing, no certified letter, no appeal, just 2 hours and 18 minutes. My attorney warned that calling a judge could look like abuse of office, so I stood in a hotel bathroom listening to my neighbor describe an excavator tearing through Rachel's glass atrium. He sent me a video. Marlene stood beside the machinery in a cream-colored coat, arms folded, watching the roof collapse. And when the reflecting pool split open and poured down the ridge, she smiled. That was the moment I stopped believing this was about rules. Marlene wanted my land, and she thought destroying the house would erase the reason I would fight for it. I landed just after midnight and drove 2 hours through freezing rain, and by the time I reached Briar Summit, the machines were gone, the cameras were gone, and the only thing left was the smell. Diesel fuel, wet insulation, shattered cedar, all of it hanging in the air like the house was still trying to breathe. I stood where Rachel's kitchen had been and felt something inside me go completely quiet. Anger is loud when it first arrives, but real grief is different. It makes the whole world sound far away. Then I remembered the safe beneath her studio. Rachel had insisted on it because she kept original drawings, contracts, and material records for every project she designed, and she used to joke that architects trusted concrete more than people. I found a shovel in my neighbor's garage and started digging through plaster, glass, and broken beams until my hands were bleeding through my gloves. Around 4 in the morning, the shovel struck steel. The safe was scorched, dented, buried under 18 inches of debris. But it opened. Inside were Rachel's sketches, every approval letter from the architectural committee, every canceled check, every fine receipt, and a folder labeled Marlene, because apparently my wife had understood that woman before I did. At sunrise, my attorneys arrived. The first was Nathan Cole, a 68-year-old land use lawyer who looked half asleep until he saw an illegal document, then became more alert than a hunting dog. The second was Priya Shah, a civil rights attorney who had recently won a major discrimination case against a county police department. Nathan walked the property with a legal pad, muttering statute numbers under his breath, while Priya photographed everything, including the tire marks, the broken pool, and the warning notice Marlene had nailed to what remained of my gate. After 20 minutes, Nathan looked at me and said, "Caleb, this isn't sloppy, this is criminally stupid. There had been no certified notice, no hearing, no valid board vote, and no court order authorizing demolition. Marlene had signed the work order herself, hired her brother-in-law's demolition company, and scheduled the job for the 1 week she knew I would be out of state. By 8, local news crews started arriving, and that was when we learned Marlene had invited them. She wanted a victory speech. She stood in front of my ruins wearing pearls and a pale blue coat, telling a reporter that no one was above community standards, not even the governor. I let her finish, then stepped into the frame holding a stack of canceled checks. The reporter nearly dropped his microphone. "Governor Mercer, did you refuse to pay the fines?" he asked. "No," I said, looking straight at Marlene. "The HOA cashed every one of these." Her face tightened. I showed the camera the payment dates, then the committee approvals she had overruled without a board vote. Nathan read the relevant section of the bylaws aloud, and for the first time in 11 years, Marlene Voss had nothing to say. She climbed into her Lincoln and drove away so fast, gravel hit the newsvan. I thought that would be the beginning of her retreat. Instead, it was the beginning of the war. Within 48 hours, anonymous accounts were posting that I had built Rachel's house with campaign money. A radio host called me a spoiled politician crying over a mansion. Marlene went on a local podcast and described herself as a frightened volunteer who had been bullied by a powerful man. She even claimed I had threatened her, which would have been more convincing if Priya had not saved 3 years of emails showing that every conversation between us had been in writing. I wanted to answer publicly, but Priya stopped me. "Let her talk," she said. "People like Marlene always believe the next lie will rescue the last one." So we stayed quiet and started knocking on doors. That was how I met Ruth Holloway, a 77-year-old widow who lived 2 houses down from mine. Marlene had claimed Ruth filed complaints about my property, but when I asked her, Ruth started crying. She brought out a cardboard box filled with 4 years of violation letters. $300 because her roses were too tall, $500 because her trash can remained visible until noon, $1,200 because her grandson parked an old pickup in her driveway. Marlene had brought her a complaint about my house and threatened to foreclose if she refused to sign it. Ruth was not the only one. Within 2 weeks, 29 families gave us sworn statements. A young couple had been fined $8,000 over their teenage daughter's car. A veteran had been threatened because his wheelchair ramp did not match the approved wood stain. Elena told Priya about the 4 times Marlene demanded proof of citizenship. What had happened to me was not an isolated fight. It was a business model. Nathan demanded the HOA's financial records, and Marlene resisted until a judge ordered her to produce them. When the boxes finally arrived, a forensic accountant spent 3 days going through the books. At 11 one night, Nathan called and said, "You need to come now." His conference table was covered in bank statements. $65,000 had gone to a security company owned by Marlene's husband, though there was no contract and no evidence of work. $48,000 went to her daughter's landscaping company. More than $100,000 collected from homeowners for road repairs had been transferred to a Wyoming corporation controlled by Marlene and her family, while the paving contractor remained unpaid. Then Priya found the email that changed everything. Marlene had written to a developer 18 months earlier, "Caleb will not sell, so we need to create pressure." The developer had offered her a private commission if she could acquire my property below market value. The fines, the harassment, the demolition, none of it had been about porch beams or wildflowers. She wanted Rachel's land, and she had used the HOA like a private weapon to take it. Before we could announce what we had found, someone broke into the storage trailer where I had placed the pieces of Rachel's house that survived. Her design journal vanished. 3 cedar beams marked in her handwriting were taken, and across the inside wall someone had sprayed, "Go back to the Capitol." I sat on the trailer step staring at those words until Elena found me. She sat beside me without speaking, then finally said, Mrs. Rachel did not build that house so you could surrender to the person who destroyed it." That night, we made a decision. We would not expose Marlene in a private courtroom where she could settle, seal the records, and pretend nothing happened. We would confront her at the next HOA town hall, in front of every homeowner she had frightened, every family she had robbed, and every camera she had once invited to celebrate my destruction. 3 weeks later, the Briar Summit Clubhouse was packed so tightly people were standing along the walls, and Marlene walked to the podium wearing a white suit, silver bracelets, and the same expression she had worn beside the bulldozers, calm, polished, absolutely certain the room still belonged to her. What she did not know was that my neighbor had 3 cameras running, 2 reporters were sitting in the back row, and more than 600 homeowners and local residents were watching the live stream. Marlene began with property values, holiday decorations, and a new fitness room nobody had asked for. Then she casually mentioned $78,000 in legal expenses caused by what she called one disgruntled resident. That was when Nathan stood and said, "You introduced the subject, so now we get to discuss it." Marlene tried to adjourn the meeting, but one of her own board members, Denise Porter, rose from the front table. "Before you do," Denise said, holding up an email, "I want everyone to know I was never told about the vote to demolish Caleb's house." The room went silent. Marlene claimed it had been an emergency decision, so Priya projected another email onto the screen dated nearly a month before the demolition, in which Marlene wrote, "Caleb will be out of state. That is our window." I walked to the microphone carrying the binder we had pulled from Rachel's safe. "You told the news I owed $41,000. I said, "Here are 22 canceled checks proving your HOA collected every cent." Copies moved through the room, hand to hand, and the mood changed fast. People stopped looking at me like a governor and started looking at Marlene like a thief. Then Elena stood. Her voice shook, but she did not. She described being stopped at the gate, questioned about citizenship, and told people like her did not belong there. Marlene interrupted. "I was protecting the community." Elena looked directly at her and asked, "From a 50-year-old woman carrying cleaning supplies?" Somebody in the back laughed, then somebody else applauded, and within seconds the whole room was on its feet. Marlene pounded the gavel until Nathan placed the bank records on the table. He showed the payments to her husband's security company, the money sent to her daughter's landscaping business, and the road fund transferred to a corporation controlled by her family. The paving contractor stepped forward and announced that Briar Summit still owed him $134,000, enough for him to place a lien on the clubhouse, pool, and entrance gates. Homeowners began shouting that they had already paid the assessment. Marlene's attorney leaned over and whispered something, but she shoved him away. "This community was successful because of me," she yelled. "I kept standards. I kept outsiders from changing what we built." Priya asked quietly, "And was Caleb's property one of the things you intended to take?" The final email appeared on the screen, Marlene promising a developer she could force me to sell below market value in exchange for a commission. Her face emptied. For the first time, there was no speech, no rule book, no clever answer, just silence. Denise called for an emergency vote, and the board removed Marlene as president before she could leave the room. A county investigator waiting near the rear doors stepped forward and asked her and her husband to remain for questioning. Marlene looked at me as if I had betrayed her. "You destroyed my life," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, Marlene, I kept receipts." 6 days later, federal agents searched her home. She eventually pleaded guilty to fraud, embezzlement, and witness intimidation, while the HOA's insurance company paid settlements to 29 families. Ruth kept her home. Elena received a public apology, and the road contractor finally paid his crew. I rebuilt Rachel's house, but smaller this time, using the cedar beams that were recovered from a warehouse rented by Marlene's husband. On the first evening in the new house, I sat beside the reflecting pool and watched the sunset turn the water orange, just as Rachel had drawn it. Still, one question followed me afterward. Some people said exposing Marlene publicly was justice, while others said I had used my position and the cameras to humiliate a woman before she had been convicted. Maybe they were right about part of that. But when someone has hidden behind closed doors for 11 years, sometimes the truth needs an audience. So tell me what you think. Did I fight back the right way? Or did I cross a line by turning that meeting into a public trial? Leave your answer in the comments, share this story with anyone who has ever dealt with an abusive HOA, and subscribe, because the next person who thinks a little authority makes them untouchable may already be living right next door.